Well, good morning. We are excited to be here today, and we have a lot to share in a 50-minute time frame. So we will be as quick to explain as possible, but we also have questions throughout the presentation. If there are questions, we'd rather really get the answers to you instead of speed through. So if we don't get the things, we will have the presentation available within this, and then also Patton will have it. So would like just to take a minute to introduce ourselves. As shared, we are from State College Area School District, which is right where the University Park campus of Penn State is. So we are considered a suburban school, but we're in a very rural area in the middle of the state. So I am excited to be here. The bulk of the presentation is going to be from our two of our school psychologists today. They have really done a lot of the work and helped support getting the approval for RTI for SLD. And so you'll be hearing from them. And then, again, it's just really important from a district lens, if you are in central administration, to really work with them to learn it and make sure that we are taking the right steps to move the entire district forward. Welcome, and I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the presentation. And I am Danielle Yoder. So I focus on K-5 in our district.
And I'm Janelle Meadows, and I'm a school psychologist in the district.
My name's Megan Hutchinson, and I work in a K-5 elementary building in the district.
And I'm Jonathan Klingerman, Federal Programs and Gifted Services, oversee several programs and work collaboratively with the school psychs and our Title I reading specialists in the elementary.
So just a little bit, this is what we're going to do today. So we won't be offended if this is what you weren't thinking and you head out. We hope you stay. We will give a little bit of our district background, show you SCASD's tiered model for supports. We're still growing in that area, and we'll talk about that. Talk about the advanced tiers and how that is moving forward with us, and then really dig into the depth of response to intervention for SLD determination. I think over a year ago, we received it for K-5. Prior to that, we were only K-3, and we only do have it for reading. Math is hopefully down the road for us. At the end, we will talk about inclusive practices. I learned so much over the past 48 hours that we know we have work to do in our district, but we'll talk about some of those initiatives. We are trying that this year, understanding that we're not really where we need to be with that.
So we want to start, we didn't know how many people would be here, but we thought we'd try to judge the room a little bit. So we're going to do a quick audience poll of where we're from, and we'd also like to judge a little bit about what your knowledge is of RTI and MTSS. So if I see most people have the QR code up, I'll change the screen in just a second. It should take you to a Mentimeter quick poll. And if Awesome. Pull this up. So this quick one right here, just taking a look at where everyone is located. Throughout the conference, I was pretty excited to see the widespread of, specifically we were looking at PBIS, but this is super helpful for us, and you can see we do have a scattered amount of people here from across the state. Okay. What's your RTI for SLD status? You are seasoned, fully implemented. You are kind of new to it, but fully implemented. You're working towards implementation, or what is RTI for SLD? This would be super helpful for us. As we're talking today, we've been using RTI for SLD as a district for years and continue to try to enhance and improve it. How long? Probably 15 years. So we were one of the original school districts that were approved by the state. And through our collaborative work with Patton and the PD sessions that we've had over the past 5 years, we've really been working towards improving that. And continuing to advocate to make it more readily available for districts rather than an approval process. So Looks like a nice little spread, but again, working towards implementation, and so a lot of newer people in terms of that. So great information. Thank you for that specific piece. A little bit about State College. Our demographics are changing. Some people think that we have been and have always been this big university town that is not very diverse. However, our demographics are changing rapidly. So pushing almost 7,000 students within Center County, 8 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, 1 high school, and then we actually have a middle school, high school democratic school, which is a lottery-based school system as well. And we do offer our virtual hybrid school for K-12 as well. ESL population, like most of you are probably seeing in your schools, are growing pretty rapidly. We have a large influx specifically of migrant students from in and around Guatemala that have been coming to the community. We're working closely to be able to support that. We do received, or for the past 2 years, have been receiving Title III immigrant funds, which is all based on the numbers of students that you've had as immigrants in prior years. So that is something new for us to be managing. We're also really looking at how our socioeconomic status has changed. Our Title I funding has been pretty stable for the past several years, but has gone up substantially over the past year as well due to new census data. So we're still adjusting to that. One of the challenges we have with our ESL population, though we have a lot of students, and Spanish being our most needy population in terms of that, we have about 45 different languages across the school district that are coming in from our home language surveys, but Chinese is our number 1 most populous language. One of the bigger challenges, again, that we have too is with our economically disadvantaged. When we specifically look at our elementary system, schools that are down into 11%, and now we're up to about 40%. And that 40% school has actually doubled in its poverty over the past 3 years. Never used to be the highest, but it is now one of the highest schools. And we continue to put more funding through Title I into that building and ensuring that as the need continues to grow, the resources are there. And though we only have 4 Title I schools, we do have an approved Title-like program where we do supplement on the schools that do not have federal funding and provide similar type services. Of this 6,800, you can kind of see the spread of our demographics: 73% white, Asian 9%, and Black 3%, with the others that are growing specifically in Hispanic and multiracial. And we are continuing to work on that undisclosed number. The work that I do in Gifted is also looking at equity, and the district has a lot of equity work that it's working on. So even though we can't specifically work towards that undisclosed, we do want to make sure that those families that are choosing that still feel that they have access to resources and that we can support them in that way. Any questions about our demographics, where we've been?
Okay, so just this slide just kind of recaps where we've been as a district. As Jonathan mentioned, we were one of the first schools to be approved to use RTI for SLD and reading. But I think it's really important as a district that we continue to evolve and stay kind of on top of the changes in research and practices, and also, after experiencing COVID, administrative turnover, we really started to drift in our implementation. Like with any systems level process, anything can kind of rock that boat. So we've been working over the past few years to tighten up our fidelity and our consistency across 8 elementary schools. So the other piece too is you can't have a really functional RTI for SLD evaluation determination without a really functional MTSS system for reading. So we are going to take a little bit of time to talk about our systems that lead to making sure we have the right kids at the end of the day that go through an MDE evaluation for special education. I just wanted to give credit to these resources. We use these 2 texts a lot to inform our practices and how to structure data team meetings, how to create our guidelines for determining low level of performance, low rate of improvement, and how to look at data and make database decisions. And we've also been working with Patton for the RTI for SLD series and the comprehensive support series as well. So I wanted to share with you how we have managed to try and organize behavioral and academic MTSS processes. So just a quick raise of hands, how many of you are doing PBIS and some sort of academic tiered support model simultaneously? Okay. I think once you start getting into those systems and teaming, it can get really hard to either integrate or tease it apart and keep things organized. We have a lot of different teams in our district, and there's a lot of overlap between behavior and academics, but at the same time, we have found it's too hard to do academics and behavioral team meetings at the same time. So we have attempted to try and just give a little bit of structure to make it bigger. We just wanted to try and give a structure to, oh, I can't move. I don't like not being able to move. So you can see this is our overview, and what we're going to focus on this morning is this academic team side on your left. More? Okay. Is that better? 100%. Okay. So you can see the different types of meetings that we do throughout the year and who are on our academic teams. We also have a core team that meets and triages different MTSS referrals. And those have turned into more of our behavior team. But this left side is what we're going to focus on today. Our advanced tier meetings, our benchmark data meetings, our tier 2, tier 3 check-in meetings. And we also still do individual student problem-solving meetings with parents and team and teachers as well. But the meetings on the left are things that are scheduled in all of our buildings every year along that same type of timeline. Okay. And we do have a flow chart that you can look at the different types of possible outcomes that might come out of some of those MTSS referrals that teachers do make. But I'm going to keep moving. So here's our tiered continuum of support. This is what our tier 1 looks like in terms of where, the group size, how long, and our progress monitoring frequency, and how it builds on each other. And we have our cake in here because Janelle likes to explain it like building a layer cake. Tier 1 is the foundation.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, you can't have the upper tiers. Yeah, I have to go. You can't have tiers 2 and 3 if you don't have a solid tier 1, right? They all build on top of each other. And then you have special education, which is supposed to be aligned, right, with those tiers to kind of top off the cake. And they also couldn't be supported without that structure underneath, even though they're more individual supports. Okay.
And I think this is something that we've really been focusing on, is aligning our tiers and the instruction that our kids that are being pulled out for interventions receive. I think in the past we did a lot of piecemealing, and they get a little bit of this here, and then they get that in tier 1, and it wasn't necessarily aligned. And sometimes with our younger students, we actually maybe had like 2 different programs teaching them phonemic awareness or phonics or something like that. So we've really tried to hone in on aligning the sequence and how things are presented to the kids that are being pulled out, and making sure that they're really only pulled out for what they absolutely need to be pulled out for. So we still have like a standard protocol approach to tier 2, where we're doing what works for most kids that are in the yellow or at risk. But we're just trying to be more purposeful with matching skill deficit to our interventions. Does anybody have any questions about that? I know we have a question time, but.
Okay, so on this slide, we have some templates that we use to guide our data team meetings. Like Megan said, we do have those pre-scheduled throughout the year. So we have 3 main data team meetings throughout the year to go over beginning of the year, middle of the year, and end of the year data. And we use one of these forms. You'll see there is a form for beginning, middle, and end to guide our discussions at those meetings. And this is from one of those books that Megan also showed on an earlier slide. At least it's adapted from. We made it our own, but that was the foundation. So we use this form to put together all of our data for each grade level. So each grade level gets one of these forms, and we use it to guide our discussions. We talk a lot about, it's not about the form itself necessarily, but it's how the form is structured to help us have good conversations about the data. And it's also, the first part of it, we're looking at tier 1. What do all of our students look like? What is the data telling us for the grade level as a whole? We try to stay away from individual student conversations when we're having this discussion, because we're really looking at the data as a whole, what's happening at tier 1. We set a goal based on the data that we have, and then from there, we will drill down a little bit and group our students by skill deficits. And so again, though, we're still looking at all of the data versus individual student problem solving. And then when you scroll a little further, this is where we form our groups, our intervention groups for tier 2 and tier 3 students. And if we need to have a more in-depth conversation about a student, we wouldn't do it here. We would have it later at an individual student meeting. So that's that. And then in between those beginning, middle, and end of the year meetings, we do have a check-in in the fall and the spring to go over just tier 2 and 3 students and their data. And we use this form for that. First, we look at the skills as a whole in all of the groups so that we can say, okay, in this tier 2 group, most of the students are in the green with one student in the red. So there's one outlier there, right? The other students are making progress. Or you might look at a group here and say, oh, they're all in the red but one student. So is that a student problem or is that a group problem? So again, looking at the data more big picture. And then as you go down, we do have some opportunities to talk about students a little more individually and see if they're making data or growth or not with their data. So these are the forms that you can access. And then we also have this template that helps guide whether or not we're staying on track with our meetings. It kind of, again, makes sure that all of the critical components are there at our meetings. So it keeps us on track, but it also serves as a fidelity checklist as well, just to make sure that everything is in place. And this can be completed after you have those beginning, middle, and end of the year meetings. Any questions so far? Okay.
Do you want to talk about, real quick, just quick?
Yeah.
So you've done 6 to 8 weeks, you do the tier 2, 3 meeting, and there's group, what do you do with the kids that aren't working before benchmark?
Okay, so
Regardless
going
of
back.
if they're tiers or not.
So at these meetings, so yeah, Danielle brings a good point. So at these meetings, at the beginning of the year, middle of the year, end of the year, and the tier 2 and 3 check-ins, that's where we'll make decisions about whether or not we need to switch interventions or move students between intervention groups or tiers based on how much data we have and what kind of progress they're making. So that's when we can make some of those tier decisions. Is that what you mean?
Okay, so we're going to get into our process for planning for more individualized reading interventions. I mentioned previously for tier 2, we typically have more of a standard protocol approach, go to things that we try for kids who are just below benchmark to see if that works. And then if after 6 to 8 weeks of progress monitoring, we're not seeing the type of response that we want to, and the student is mostly an outlier in their tier 2 group, we look at tier 3 intervention planning. So I've included a little flow chart that helps the decision guidelines for that, and you can see at the top, the major question is, are the majority of tier 2 students making adequate growth? And if you look at the orange side, you can see you identify those non-responders and you reevaluate what you're doing and you restart the problem-solving process for that individual student. How can we intensify the instruction? Are there other factors to consider? Maybe the student has been missing a lot of school. Maybe there's attention factors to consider and the data is inconsistent. So these are all types of things that we discuss as a data team whenever we meet. And we bump up our progress monitoring based on that original chart. They go from every other week to weekly when they move to tier 3. And And again, we don't usually add or exit students at these tier 2, tier 3 check-in meetings. That happens after benchmarking. And this is just another little visual that helps pinpoint what things to think about whenever you're talking about, do we need to do something different for a student? Goal setting is very important, so thinking about the type of goal that you're setting for a student when you're doing an individualized plan, you need it to be meaningful, but it's also going to be an ambitious goal because they're starting out much further behind than their peers and they have a lot of gap to make up. You need to give the intervention time to work. Sometimes we have teachers that feel like they already know the outcome that's going to happen for a student, and there's a little bit of like can we just get to the fact that I think they need an IEP or they need more intensive support. And we really have to give the student the benefit of the doubt and see if what works that's less restrictive and less time out of the classroom is going to be effective as well. And we need to make those decisions with at least 12 data points. We look at group progress. I think that's really something that we've tried to improve upon, is having kind of more of a big picture look at grade level data, class-wide data, groups, and then individual. We've tried to do a better job at looking at progress and looking for non-responders all throughout those tiers. And then there's just different things to think about to intensify instruction. So these are just some reminders. I think that as teams embark on this process, it's an ongoing process. Intensive intervention, it's not really an event. You need to dose what's needed and not what fits the schedule. And this is probably, the biggest obstacle that we face is the schedule and where you get the time to do all of this. And typically our kids that are struggling the most in reading may also have OT services or speech, or they also get math services. So they are being pulled out and they need intervention for different types of areas. And I think the other piece that we've really been looking at is intensifying interventions is a lot more than just increasing time and decreasing group size. What really matters is what you're doing with that time, not just that you're adding another 20 minutes to their intervention, but the quality of what you're doing. Is it matched to what they need? Are there high opportunities to respond? Are you giving immediate feedback? And is it tied to exactly what they need that's also aligned with what they're doing in the classroom? So pre-teaching vocabulary, pre-teaching an ECRI lesson that's going to help them be more successful in Tier 1 are some of the things that we've been talking about recently.
Okay, so once we make the determination that a student needs to move into a Tier 3 program, there are some key features. This is an individual student focus at this level of intervention. We want to make sure we're using evidence-based practices and making data-focused decisions. Once we have a Tier 3 plan in place, we like to have follow-up meetings, maybe 6 to 8 weeks to revisit the plan and see what progress the student is making. And this team should include, at the very least, right, the principal, general education teacher, interventionist working with the student, and a school psychologist. In terms of family involvement, we've kept this a little flexible. We can do family involvement in a number of ways. Sometimes, we have a family meeting and go over the Tier 3 plan together. Everyone comes to the table with the family. Sometimes we might call a family to go over the plan that way, if that's the preferred method of sharing the information. A meeting is always offered. We share a copy of the plan with the family. We can also talk about moving a child to Tier 3 without a meeting. Maybe we just contact the parent by phone for the initial implementation of that plan, and then we bring them back in 6 to 8 weeks to review progress after we've had some time to do the interventions. And then, of course, if we're moving to an evaluation, again, sometimes we have a school psychologist call the family to talk about it. Sometimes we bring the family in for a meeting. It just depends on the family and what works best for the student. But we have kept that flexible to meet the different needs of the families we serve. So once you're in Tier 3, we use a Tier 3 intervention plan document to track all of the interventions the student is receiving and the progress they're making. So here is an example of what that looks like. So on this plan, we might include some background information, history of Tier 2 supports. The intervention plan itself, of course, is listed with the targeted skill, the interventionist, the group size, the frequency, when that intervention starts, and including who's completing the progress monitoring and how frequently. This is another place you can put data as needed. It's a really nice form to use for a parent meeting. Everything is right there for the student, and this helps to guide the meeting with the family. And then there's a separate section to put anything that's discussed at that meeting, and of course, an action plan moving forward. And then this is just a sample that you can reference if you have questions about what goes where. So this is an example of an intervention plan that has been completed. And some data that we use. So that's something that you can access. Similar to the checklist that we showed earlier for the benchmark meetings, the data team meetings, there's also a checklist for Tier 3 intervention. Looks very similar. And just make sure that all of the critical components are included and really shows that all of the things that we've been doing throughout the tiers that get us to this point have been done. So again, kind of a fidelity check as well. And then also this can be used, there's a portion of it, and a lot of it's right up here, actually copied from the checklist that's specifically related to whether or not you're moving a child forward for an evaluation. Again, building upon all of the things that have already been done and making sure that we have checked all of those boxes and completed the process with fidelity. Okay, so just some food for thought now that we're at this stage of the process, the tiered process. So gated decision-making and targeted interventions improve our decision accuracy of who's truly at risk. So once you've gone through all of those steps, we can feel pretty confident that we have the kids that we should have at this stage. We're pushing for the correct kids towards an evaluation. And of course, we're always still considering the other components that go into why a child might be struggling. So we're still talking about the behavioral, the social, and the emotional needs of students. We're still talking about all of those things, and those things do impact whether or not we think a disability is present. But again, if we've gone through all of these processes, we should really have the correct kiddos. And this is a favorite, I think, for us to discuss, but it's easier to just keep assessing, right, and keep collecting data. It's harder to plan, implement, and sustain the intervention, right? All that extra data, it doesn't necessarily make it easier to pick the kids that should be going forward with an evaluation. Because really the ultimate question is the student making meaningful progress over time? You want to add anything to that? Any questions at this stage? Okay. I think this is even.
So for those of you that aren't familiar, there are a couple ways that you can choose to evaluate a student for special education using two methods: response to intervention and the discrepancy model, where you're giving a cognitive assessment and an achievement assessment and comparing what they should be achieving versus what they are. There was, in the panel yesterday, they were talking about how it's the best option out of not great options that we have. And I think what is encouraging about using RTI for SLD determination is that when you have a functional, efficient, effective MTSS system, you're getting the kids who are your lowest performing kids in the building and that haven't responded to what typically works. So it's a valid way to look at the kids who truly need more supports through special education. It's not a perfect process, and I think it also speaks to the importance of consistency. If you're working in a district that has a number of different elementary schools and a number of different psychologists completing evaluations, you can get into making different decisions based on the school that a child is enrolled in. So that's where a lot of this also comes from with the consistency of our data team structure, our fidelity checklist, how we're making decisions has to be consistent across buildings so that we're making high stakes decisions, special education eligibility decisions in a consistent way for all of our students, and also reducing disproportionality. That was something that was a concern in our district, and RTI is a great way, if you're battling that in your districts, to take steps towards solving that problem.
If I could say
Yes.
something, and Jonathan may pipe in too. So again, 8 elementary schools, we hope everybody's doing it right, but how do you check? So last year, Jonathan, our special ed director, and we had at that time an elementary curricular coordinator, said, how are some of these, like, let's look at these special ed kids, or let's do some checks on progress monitoring. And we looked at title students, we looked at special ed students, just to look at different buildings. Like we would say, hey, let's try this building today, and begin to look at it. And that's when we began to see that we needed to come back to the table with MTSS and helping to understand the RTI for SLD, because we had some students, we found a lot of things through those. And it wasn't a got you. It was never, we're going to that school and saying, what the heck are you doing? It was, oh, we have some work in this area because we're not sure this special ed child in progress monitoring is continuing to drop. So we've got to get in there, and we'll talk about that. But the other thing was, because she said we have a couple schools that are very, very high achieving, it almost looked like we were maybe identifying students that would not have been necessarily identified as schools that have a lower median overall. So by adding those in at the central level, I know it's time and to try to get everybody together. But if that's how we need to get to impacting and focusing on the students who really need quality interventions and really need to look at those plannings, that time, and I would think Jonathan would agree, has been so valuable. We just put them back in again this year just to make sure. It even gave us an opportunity to look at the goals within the IEPs to say, well, what are they progress monitoring on if we don't see the data that we need to see? So again, it allowed us to come back, meet with all 8 elementary schools, but also have conversations with individual, Jonathan oversees the school psychs or helps to. He was able to then go to some of the school psychs and review some things too, just to make better overall plans so that our district was improving everywhere instead of just at the differing buildings.
One of the challenges that we've been having is also dealing with the silos that I know all of you have been dealing with as well. So that's a major shift for even some of our most experienced teachers to be looking at the district approaching student intervention in need as everyone can work with them versus they're mine, I'm only going to work with them. So opening up those communication lines has been great for the schools that have been moving forward with that. Others have been more challenged with understanding, oh, they're special ed, I'm only going to work with them, versus a title teacher is already working with a small group that has that exact same need. Why would we not keep all of them together? So we're no longer classifying special ed teachers, ESL teachers, Title I interventionists, et cetera. We're saying intervention and support teachers and who has the capacity and where does that fit. And I think that that's really been shifting and helping us to kind of move forward with this alignment so that we can eliminate, because, and I know you'll get into this in a minute, but we still have a lot of people that feel special ed is a place that we are trying to get to, and we are really trying to put the reins on that, because a lot of what we're seeing is, again, if you put in the right medicine, the chances of them being able to make that progress, successful progress, and not go that whole way has been really helpful, and we've seen great success in that as well.
Okay, so this next section is really sharing with you what our interpretation of the Chapter 14 guidelines look like. So this is how all of our school psychologists make decisions for what students qualify for learning disabilities in reading based on their response to intervention. So we use a dual discrepancy model where the first prong is level and then the second prong is growth. So as a school psychology department, this is what we all, at the elementary level, this is what we operate within. So we have a definition for inadequate achievement relative to age or grade. So the top part, you'll see a lot of this is pulled right from the regulations, and then underneath it is our interpretation of what does that actually look like and what does that mean. And this is where it's hard because I think as a practitioner, we all go to the texts, even the ones that I showed before, and we say, okay, we know inadequate achievement, but like how low is low, how slow is slow. And no one ever really comes out and says exactly what it should be. So again, this is how we've interpreted the guidelines. We've done a lot of looking and researching, and we feel like with the information that we're given as like educational professionals, this is our best interpretation of it, and we do feel like it's been, like, our prevalence rates are about what they should be, so I do feel confident that these guidelines are working for us right now. But you can see the different types of academic information that we get to use. It's not just one type of piece of data that we're looking at for level of performance. We go from the 10th, and we sometimes go up to the 13th. Okay, so prong 2 is growth, which is a pattern of inadequate growth defined by rate of improvement. We look at student growth percentiles, and we use Acadience, so we get the pathways of progress reports as well. This was a very big change whenever we moved from AimsWeb to Acadience, and the psychs had a lot of questions about student growth percentiles, and was that replacing rate of improvement, and how is that part of our decision-making process? Acadience also doesn't give you rate of improvement, so we have to calculate that in-house. So I shared the spreadsheet that we use on a later slide when we have some sample data for you. But overall, the pathways of progress are nice because it's part of that MTSS process and those data team discussions. And I think we'll get to it later with how we use high stakes versus low stakes decisions in terms of growth. But you can see we look at really student growth that's 1.5 to 2 times discrepant from the expected growth is our overall definition, and those are rate of improvement calculations. We look at attained growth, and we also look at what does the student need to close the gap, and we also look at their comparison to expected, just minimal benchmark performance. Okay, so this is a little bit more about student growth percentiles versus rate of improvement.
Yeah, so when we're talking about student growth, we can look at it a couple different ways. The first way is rate of improvement, which is how much is the child growing over time. The pros of using a rate of improvement, it is sensitive to changes in skills based on instruction, and it is based on multiple data points over time. The cons, it can take a lot of data points, right? 10 to 12 data points to establish a reliable trend, and it is susceptible to outlier scores. That can kind of make your slope look a little different. We use it for high stakes decisions. It is one of the 2 inclusionary criteria that Megan just talked about to determine growth. And we also use it to monitor growth in Tier 3 intervention as well. So we're looking at that, and that also helps us know, too, a little bit about what student isn't growing enough and would be a good referral for an evaluation. So we are looking at that at Tier 3 as well. But that's what we use for the high-stakes decisions, and we prefer that over the student growth percentiles when making an SLD determination. So student growth percentiles. So student growth percentiles tell us how is a student growing compared to other kids who started at the same place as them. So their growth is only compared to another child who started at the same score as they did, okay? And you have to have 2 benchmark scores in order to calculate that. So for your beginning of the year benchmark score, you're not going to be able to see a student growth percentile. But middle of the year, you can see how have they grown compared to other students who had the same beginning of the year benchmark. Okay, and there'll be a graph on the next page, I think, that'll help visualize that, which is a really great thing to know, and there are pros to it. You're comparing them, they're normative comparisons to academic peers, and you can more quickly determine if they're on the right path, right? Are they on the right trajectory? Is their growth helping set them up to meet their goal or close the gap? The cons, rates of growth are not normally distributed. So statistically, it gets a little more complicated looking at those numbers. And that growth doesn't account for variables related to instruction and interventions. We use them for goal setting at tier 2 and 3, because when you have their growth trajectory, you can see if they make the most growth we could expect of them for where they started, where could they get to? What goal could we set for them that's reasonable? And we can use them also to make sure that the groups of students are responding to intervention and rule out a lack of appropriate instruction. So when you're looking at a small group, if most students in that group who started at the same place are making good growth, the intervention we can assume is doing the right thing, and then you can pick out the outliers more easily. But that's a low stakes decision, okay? So here's some data that might help give a visual to some of those things that we're looking at. So the first, and these are from Acadience, these are Acadience graphs, it's what we use. The first graph is off grade level progress monitoring. Okay, so for this is a second grade student, the first graph is looking at first grade oral reading fluency. Okay, so we basically just see the trajectory there and their data points. They're making growth, but they're below that aim line. They're growing, but slowly. But there's no pathways of progress for this student because it's off grade level. So we can't get those student growth percentiles when you're doing an off grade level probe. Okay, but it is good to see how they're growing at their instructional level. The next graph is showing their progress monitoring on grade level oral reading fluency. So again, you can see that they're growing, they're making progress on that probe, but the blue, and actually they're making what would be called, it's good growth. It's well above typical growth for where they started. So in September, you can follow that blue line. Can you see my, you can follow that blue line. They're making well above typical growth, okay, which is awesome. But if you look at that target, even with max growth that we could expect from them based on where they started, they are nowhere near that green benchmark line, right? That's their level. And so while growth is a really important component of this, and we talk about this a lot, think about how much time would be required for them to close that gap. It's a lot. So you can look at the next graph. So this first graph is the rate of improvement graph that we graph ourselves because, again, Acadience doesn't provide that graph. So we just put it in an Excel document, which I'll show you. Oh, no, but I can't.
You would have to go and get it.
I'll have to get it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Just we can.
Yeah. Yeah.
it's a Google sheet.
Yes.
You just all use the same spreadsheet and make copies of it. And
You just put in the data.
If any words change, and everybody can put the data in, and it gives you the graph.
Yep, it shows this graph. It pops up. So the lines on here, so you have the target. The blue line is the target. That's benchmark, how typical kids, if they were going from benchmark to benchmark to benchmark, would grow. This student is the yellow line, and you can barely see it, but red is the 10th percentile. So you can also see kind of how their trajectory is like right there on that 10th percentile line. And then we can use this chart here to then calculate the percent that they've attained. And remember, we talked about we need them to make 125% or more of what's expected growth in order to say, okay, they have a chance at closing that gap. So this student from fall to spring, and this is a whole year, that we're looking at the whole year, we're not looking at half years on this example. From fall to spring, this student's rate of improvement was 0.91 words per correct per minute. It's expected, if you're looking at grade level benchmark, for them to grow at 1.13 words correct per minute. So that's 80%. That child, if you divide this top number into this number below, that's 80% of the expected growth. That's not that 125 that we're looking for. And then if you look at their goal, how much they would need to grow to meet their goal, they're only making 34% of that growth. And here's a chart you can use to calculate that, just as an example. Oh, and then these are just examples of write-ups that you can look at how we include this information in a report. So this is looking at level, and this is looking at growth. So those are just examples you can use. Oh, and then this is, there's so much more. And this is the exclusionary. Yeah. It's just a reference. Yes, this is the exclusionary criteria, ruling out other disabilities, ruling out other factors such as ELL status, and ruling out a lack of appropriate instruction, just as a guide. This is actually Megan.
Oh, this is just more like food for thought as you're working through these things. A lot of schools have a lot of data anymore, and you can actually get a little bit of paralysis by analysis. And as psychs, we try and be really careful about having purposeful assessment in our evaluations. And Amanda Vanderhayden is, I don't know if any of you have had the chance to hear her speak, but she talks about how weighing a cow doesn't make it fatter. Like it doesn't, like you have to actually do something and intervene, and that's actually improving your decision accuracy and making a difference for the child. So just assessing the same thing over and over and over again isn't going to solve the problem. And something we ask as psychs is the need for that cognitive ability piece in an evaluation. Legally, we don't need to give it, and I think spending more time doing those drill down assessments and diagnostic assessments that can inform the IEP and the instruction moving forward is a better use of time. The other thing that we really are trying to work on is that the creation of an IEP should pick up right from where that Tier 3 plan left off. And just because a student is eligible for special education, as you saw in Janelle's example of data, that student was making well above typical progress. Now, did their level of risk change? No, they were still in the red. And that's why they have the right to be identified as a student with a disability, have those safeguards in place, but you may still continue with that type of intervention for them, adding in accommodations, modifications in the classroom, specially designed instruction. It doesn't mean you scrap everything you've been doing because they're now eligible and restart. And I think that's the main key of aligning your tiers and making sure that your instruction is fluid across all tiers and giving all of your teams time to collaborate and talk about those kids that are most resistant to the instruction. I know we are a little short on time, so we're going to finish up with our last section, and then we'll have questions at the end.
We can start there and just explain it back in the presentation.
Okay.
So really at the end, we just went through some slides. It's what Megan was already saying. With regards to special education, it's not something totally separate, and that is a really big shift. And we realize we need more PD for it. But if you are interested in just some of those inclusionary practices, like I said, we realize we're out of time. They will be in the slideshow that you can take a look at, and you can certainly reach out to any of us if you have questions. But we have about 2 minutes before you end, and we want to be respectful of time. Are there any questions before you head out today? If not, we appreciate you coming. We will be up here at the end unless there's another session coming in 10 minutes, but they will still stick around, and make sure that the forms are accessible. If you decide you want to take a look at them and want more information, Megan and Janelle will gladly reach out back to you over email. Otherwise, have a great afternoon and enjoy.